certainly interesting that the same organization, that same Mooney's organization, was responsible for that big summit with Donald Trump recently.
On 9/11 20th anniversary,
of all dates.
And if you look historically, I mean, the Moonies were deeply involved in all of the anti-communist stuff in the post-war era, and then tightly involved with the formation of the Council for National Policy and Iran-Contra. I mean, it's inextricable from history that we're dealing with here.
100%. You mentioned another interesting connection to Egypt. And this is, she has a podcast, Velma Ann Ruth does, and it's fascinating listening to if you want to journey through the mind of someone who's certainly got themselves very involved in an insurrectionist movement based on a lot of falsehoods. But nevertheless, there she is in these podcasts talking about all these crazy things. And amongst other things, she, on January 25th, so just a few weeks after the insurrection, she's on a very personally directed message to Donald Trump, assuming, I guess she does, that he's listening to her podcast. It says, "Dear Sir, call General al-Sisi, the Egyptian leader, and by the simple suggestion, I would assume you know exactly what I mean. Secretary Pompeo would know everything about everything." I mean, I don't know if she has Donald Trump is a fan of her podcast or not, but it's the connection to al-Sisi is impossible to ignore because of his history supporting the Trump campaign back in 2016, but also just in general. Boy, it's a weird name to throw into the mix when you come around to January 6th.
Well, and Donald Trump called al-Sisi his favorite dictator a few years ago, and so there seems to be some connection between network, this Velma Ann Ruth and Audino and all those folks in installing al-Sisi in 2013. That seems to be the implication. So widely considered to be a dictator strongman type, much like we've seen in other parts of the world that have affiliated with Trump and his network. So I think it just deserves a great deal of historical scrutiny, as well as looking for signs of potential wrongdoing and criminal activity.
And in terms of recent history, if you go back, I don't want to go back into the Wayback Machine too far, but Volume 5, there's mention of al-Sisi and Mike Flynn as well, relates to the UN and even a vote that was coming up about the Israeli settlements. So there's a lot to still learn from Volume 5 that was released years ago.
Absolutely. It does seem like this network has big international connections, which brings us to Reichlin. Could you tell us a little bit more about who this guy is? He's certainly not your typical Pennsylvania politician. This is not that kind of guy.
Yeah, absolutely not. So he's former military, and we kind of have known for a bit that he was associated with Flynn, but recently learned a couple of other things about his recent history, and that in an interview that he did, I forget the outlet, the right-wing outlet that he was speaking with, but he did an interview where they identified him as being an employee of Flynn. So that was kind of a confirmation of the connection that we had seen, right? But in addition to that, by the way, in that same interview, I thought it was interesting. Folks are with Flynn's backstory. I think your viewers here are really aware of it, but his kind of history with Russia and his strange affinity for them, and similar to Trump. And
who among us hasn't had dinner with Putin at an RT conference? We've all been there.
Right.
Everyone's done that. Just $50,000.
Right. Well, I only got up as high as surgeon, GRU director, so I didn't get to go.
Well, there's something to aspire to.
Not that important. Yeah. So we see this history where Flynn starts kind of just basically repeating Russian talking points, like about NATO and things like that, same that Trump does. But it was interesting in this interview that Reichlin described Flynn's dissatisfaction with and departure from the Obama White House in an interesting way. The way he described it, and he's a family friend of Flynn's and an employee, right? So it's interesting to hear him say that Flynn essentially was upset that Obama was allowing folks in Afghanistan to run Russia out of the Middle East, to allow ISIS to run Russia out of the Middle East. He specifically said that, and that's what Flynn was upset about. And I thought that was really interesting, right? I mean, it kind of aligns with some other things. This is Reichlin saying it on a right-wing talk show, so grain of salt, but I thought it was really interesting, and it does align with some of the things we already knew about Flynn. But
it's certainly, we shouldn't, let's just pause here for a second and talk about Obama and Flynn. I mean, this is a really serious personal vendetta that Flynn has. I mean, it's not something that is generations old. It's something that happened between him and the former president of the United States, and it involved him being fired quite publicly for essentially losing it. I mean, that's the nice colloquial way of saying that, why he lost his position, but he apparently became really unstable in his job and was fired by Obama publicly, but was still allowed to sort of leave without losing his pensions or whatever. So he got all of that. But it's certainly, you can't ignore that as you're looking at this. This is very personal for Flynn and his cohorts there.
It very much is. And
well, I mean, in many ways, Flynn is like a disgruntled employee that also knows how to do network insurgency and psyops. Like it's the worst possible situation to have like a disgruntled employee with that skill set. So, I mean, mean, I think there's a bigger story here around U.S. counterintelligence and how we manage people so as to prevent them becoming radicalized by third-party countries, as well as just being radicalized on their own. You know, if you look at all of the different people that have been helping to drive this set of maneuvers, so many of them are ex-intelligence and ex-military, and we have done a horrible, horrible job at protecting those people from becoming radicalized and turned against the best interests of the country. So that's something that we need to figure out systemically here. And I think that that's a very underlooked aspect of this situation.
I think you're right. I think it's look at the First Amendment Praetorians and their leadership there. A lot of disgruntled people from Afghanistan. The entire Flynn family is really part of all of what's been going on, it seems, for operationally. And that's the fact that it's his family that it's doing it. It just does feel like it's a very personal, but also a deeply disturbing thing that they were sucked into what it seems to be a foreign psyop of some sort. You know, it doesn't seem like this all comes from Afghanistan. It's all right there on the border.
Yeah, on the subject of Flynn's family, there's been a little bit of tension around this because his brother is in charge of the U.S. Army Pacific Command, which is the largest army command there is and has direct interface with China. And a misstep there or some kind of bad faith action could easily escalate into some kind of very unpleasant situation. And so when you look at Flynn's family and the fact that he's got several brothers and various other relationships, his wife and sister-in-law and all these people that are like all rooting for him and fighting like a Flynn. And then you've got Charles Flynn running the frickin' Army Pacific Command. It just raises questions. Now, it may well be that Charles Flynn is the only good apple in the bunch and he's aghast and appalled at all of this. But, you know, the fact that he was in the room on January 6th when the decision was made at the Pentagon not to send National Guard troops for over 3 hours, the Army lied about that fact. It raises questions. So on the one hand, I don't intend to smear Charles Flynn's perfectly good Army career or his name, but from a counterintelligence standpoint, this doesn't read very well. And certainly from an investigatory standpoint, you would want to have every possible assurance that he was in no way involved in this and is no way sympathetic to his family's shared project, if you will.
Yeah, for a man who's concerned so much about optics, the optics of that certainly do not look great. And, you know, this one post by Reichlin here, this is, I think, it's not from Twitter, it's from Parler or one of those other sort of right-wing versions of Twitter. Yeah, in it, he's under the Flynn picture there, it says, the most respected general amongst patriots since George Washington. Traitors tremble in fear when his name is mentioned, Michael Flynn. And then it says, I wonder if he's going to come out of retirement. I mean, another sort of nod, not so subtle nod to this idea that Flynn and his family, or Flynn himself, you know, is going to be leading these patriots out of into some sort of war, into some sort of civil disobedience, into I don't know what they're threatening with all this coded language. But it's not. It certainly doesn't indicate a peaceful insurrection or peaceful protest. These guys are armed and dangerous.
Absolutely, and you know, what's
there's really.
Sorry, go ahead, Erin.
Go ahead.
Just to go back to the Reichlin connection in his recent history, because you know, photos with him and connections to him are interesting. Because we also recently learned that, at least according to one of his resumes, he was at the same time Flynn was. He actually started there in 2012.
Oh, really?
But continued there after Flynn left, and he was there until, I could be wrong about this, but I want to say until 2018. That seems a little late, so that may not be right, but he was there well after Flynn had been fired, still working at DIA. I'm not sure what his position was. This is, again, just based on a blurb and resume of his that we had found listed. But
to read too much into him, I mean, but, you know, he does speak Russian fluently. Maybe that's not a big deal. Maybe that just happens because you're in that work. But I don't know if his history is Russian. I'm not sure if his family's Russian, but it's certainly
born in the Soviet Union, if I recall.
Okay, so there you go.
And he crowdfunded an effort to create a movie about Putin that would kind of lionize Putin. So that was really interesting as well.
And the Green Beret here in the United States, and then you say now work to DIA. I mean, it's that's a pretty disturbing picture of some
security clearance,
right? Yeah, you're right. How do you get that? But it's very troubling. I mean, this guy's close to people like Youngkin. He's getting Youngkin elected. He's running around doing campaign work for Youngkin, the new Virginia governor. He'll certainly be involved in every election going forward if he's allowed to. You know, it looks like he could be maybe under the influence of a foreign country doing all these things, and so close to our political operation of the Republican Party. And if you don't pick that up, Joe,
I think it's interesting to think about foreign interference and things like that. But I wonder if it's somehow just merged back into Flynn has the tool set to do this. He has the paramilitary around him. He's got people who are following him that have been through irregular warfare techniques. Does it need to be foreign anymore at this point? Does it need to be just finding your own sort of divisiveness within the country and using those as wedge points?
I hear that a lot, and I have trouble with that because I do think it matters that there's a foreign involvement. I mean, certainly it may not even exist if there wasn't foreign involvement. I understand that there's a lot of division in a country nevertheless, but I don't think these things organically flare up. Maybe they can, but I don't think they organically flare up. I think it's very easy to dismiss the foreign influence because it's meant to be hidden, and it is hidden quite well. But it certainly exists. I mean, to dismiss it or to ignore its impact is quite dangerous, I think, because I really don't know if this would be happening to America if Russia and China weren't actively working on, and others working on the periphery to foment this division.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't want you to think that I in any way am poo-pooing away the foreign part of this, because absolutely without it, then none of this is occurring.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
No, I just wanted to add to that the history here is so clear in terms of the international alignment between this set of factions. Goes back, decades, if not probably longer than even 100 years. It's the same, network of factions. You've got, right-wing factions in Europe. You've got right-wing and organized crime factions in Russia, factions in China that are opposed to the Communist Party. And then you have this very clear sort of anti-communist faction in the United States that's existed for decades and really hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, it's the business plot people, the National Association of Manufacturers, the American Legion, the John Birch Society, the Council for National Policy. It's the same people. It's just,
over and over and over again. Exactly.
But it's the same exact network of interests.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an international problem. And right now it's flaring up. Got to get the devil back down into the hole.
Exactly. It's interesting, just buzzing up some things here about Reichlin. Here he is with Ben Carson at the White House Christmas party, because everyone gets invited to the Christmas party by the Secretary of Urban Development and Housing. There at the top there is his Russian wife. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but there you go. They both speak Russian and both have connections back to Russia. And then and this next one on the right is him basically running the political operation for Michael Flynn, where he's endorsing a candidate for the election on behalf of Michael Flynn. He's issuing these statements saying Michael Flynn endorses Tom Norton, whoever he may be. And this happens repeatedly throughout Reichlin's, quite active Instagram and Twitter feeds. You get the sense that, he's running the political wing of whatever Flynn is doing. And it's dangerous because it's obviously having an impact on a political level across the country. Erin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And to hear Reichlin describe it in his own words. So, this same Twitter researcher has unearthed video of Reichlin, some video interviews of his where he is, in his own words, described his role in some of these processes. And it's very interesting that, for instance, the election, he was casting about looking for ways to help and flew into Pennsylvania and started working with some of the attorneys there to try to find, ways to combat the election results and so forth. But then he said he stepped back and saw his role a little bit differently. And he said there were people who were working on individual legal aspects of this, but that wasn't his strength. And he basically said that the strength is big picture. And then he went on to discuss the irregular warfare experience that he had in the military and to discuss sort of this almost asymmetric warfare kind of approach that we've been seeing. And then in later videos, we actually see him describe multiple plans that they have in place, contingency plans and such, going through the legal strategy, and introduced Operation Pence Card on December 23rd, and Donald Trump retweeted him on December 23rd.
This is a really important thing that you're describing here. So Operations Pence Card, like the former vice president's name, is because they had various scenarios gamed out, whether it was Eastman or Reichlin or together. It seems to me these might have been working together. They seem to be operating under very similar sort of ideas, that they were proposing different scenarios in which to keep Donald Trump in power. And one of them involved the insurrection of January 6th. And then aspects of that involved something called the Pence Card. So what was the Pence Card specifically?
The Pence Card is essentially exactly what we saw in the Eastman memo. The Eastman memo essentially laid out specifically the process that he was using to pressure Mike Pence. And they essentially are saying that all the powers in Pence's Pence's hands, and that they have these obscure constitutional remedies that allow Pence to take control of the process and send elector slates back to the states and have them, send their own elector slates that would actually support Trump instead of the ones that they contested. This all hinged on states actually contesting their results, which thankfully did not happen because there were some people who care about democracy enough not to do that, Republicans and Democrats, thankfully, on the state and local level that kind of blocked that aspect. But if that aspect had happened, that would have been part of the plan. And so the Pence card operation was essentially describing Eastman's memo to pressure, influence, and pressure Pence into refusing these various states' electors. And what's really interesting is that, as I said, Trump retweeted Reichlin's Pence card operation tweet on the 23rd. And then the very next day, he called Eastman when Eastman was on vacation and spoke with him, family home, wherever he was on vacation, talked to him on Christmas Eve.
It does seem to me that all these things coincide. I mean, you can sort of look at Reichlin and Flynn and then, the meeting that Flynn had with Sidney Powell at the White House on the 20th. These are all events on a timeline which coincide. For one operation, we saw the events of January 6th. We saw it happen in front of our eyes. And there's more to it. Obviously, it's still going on. But this is much more than just a bunch of Republican congressmen in the House not following the rule of law here. This is a big operation external from the representatives in the White House that involves many questionable characters, from Eastman to Giuliani to Sidney Powell to this Reichlin character, operating illegal ways many times. Certainly, it feels like a lot of the things that they might have been doing were illegal, and coercing and pressuring local officials to act in certain ways. It feels like we're in the middle of a mob type operation to force a political change in America through sort of organized criminal means. Dave?
I think, sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, that's exactly really what the evidence seems to point to. And I also just wanted to really briefly highlight that a lot of the activity that this network has been pursuing seems to now be being pushed through the promotion of cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what went on with January 6th seems to have been tied in with this historical gripe over the gold standard, which, again, that's why I keep saying this goes back to 1933, 34, 1980. This keeps coming back up. And so now with all of this crazy buzz that you're seeing around crypto seems to be tied into the same set of operations. And we've got the debt ceiling limit that's coming up on December 3rd. And they seem to be curious about what would happen if we didn't raise the debt limit. I think ultimately they probably will. But there may be a lot of chaos that comes over the next few weeks as a result of that pressure to, see what happens if we don't.
Well, the one thing that worries me, to align to what you're saying here, is if you've got politicians under so much pressure, whether it's personal pressure, financial pressure, or just general pressure from their funders, who knows where it's coming from, but they're under so much pressure to behave in certain ways that they could do something that's very dangerous to the country, where normally these representatives might not operate in this way. But considering the tactics and the effect they've had so far, leading up to things like the insurrection, it could be that they do something dangerous, that we're still in a state of some sort of war where you've got unbelievable pressure that's not allowing the normal course of democracy to proceed.
Yep. And, I think if you look back historically, this is exactly what Larry McDonald was talking about doing with Western Goals when he created that in 1980 as a private intelligence agency to use, any means necessary to gather dirt on Americans so as to be able to exert control over them. And that's why something like Palantir is like the direct ideological successor to something like that. Now, who knows, what kind of dirt has been brought to bear on different people for different reasons. But I mean, that seems to fit the evidence based on what we've been seeing. And it certainly matches what, Mr. Stern was claiming in terms of the desire and willingness to use intelligence to move people to specific outcomes. So I think, we kind of need to go under the assumption that we are under attack of this kind and that democracy is not exactly intact at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Really unstable, the situation we're in right now. And I think the tendency for everyone is to imagine that everything's okay. Let's have arguments about the BBB and the infrastructure bill. I don't think that's really what we're seeing. We're seeing these global forces impacting our local politics to create this dysfunction and chaos that is far greater and far more significant than what's happening inside the Capitol, and more troubling because, we basically got a political party that potentially is being kept hostage. And I have no sympathy for the Republicans at this point, but I still feel like they could be under the equivalent of a hostage situation where they've been held against their will to act in certain ways against their will.
I think we've seen this too, and I want to go back a little bit to the Eastman memo and the Pence card, because I think we have to take that along with the Jeffrey Bossert-Clark letter. I think if we look at the letters that, were going on between A.G. Rosen and Jeffrey Clark, he was basically saying to the Attorney General, you should really sign this letter, because if you don't, I'll become Attorney General. So there's a little bit of muscle, strong arming in that sense as well. And I think that the two things really need to work in concert with each other. I think if you look at point 1 of the Eastman memo, that kind of brings us into, well, what if Pence is unavailable? Well, okay, we knew that Pence, potentially had the potential to be unavailable. We talked about that earlier. Secondly, they said that Chuck Grassley would be the Senate pro tem. He was the plan for him. Point 2 in the Eastman memo had to do with the slate of electors, and I think that goes directly to the Jeffrey Bossert Clark letters as well.
It is really interesting that they really have all these scenarios gamed out, and I don't believe that this is just the GOP in the House determining all of this. I think you've got a much bigger operation, as we've discussed today, that goes far wider than this. We only have a couple of minutes left, but Erin, maybe you want to give us your thoughts here as we wrap the show on a first part of a much longer conversation and investigation into what really happened on that day. But what are your thoughts on today's content?
Absolutely. And so I think it's really important to be talking about this first off, because I think these are some of the contours of what we are going to see touched on. At least I hope so. The evidence seems to indicate that this is part of the story that we all need to learn about, right? Mm-hmm. And based on what I've seen from the January 6th committee subpoenas, they're on track and they're looking in the right places, it seems like to me. So I'm very hopeful and optimistic there. I'm someone who thinks that any of these investigations are going to make us 100% happy and the dream come true with puppy dogs and rainbows, and it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be what everybody wants, but I have a really good, they're looking in the right places at least, right? Especially with as I said earlier, the distance that they're going back, the time frame that they're reaching back to in terms of looking for this information. So, overall, I'm hopeful. I am someone on the DOJ side and the Garland side, I'm someone who I see things happening there, and while I am frustrated by lack of action on some fronts, I also know that if DOJ were the kind of DOJ that we want to have, we're pursuing all these investigations all the way to the top exactly the way that we want them to be, it would look exactly like it does right now, ideally.
Yeah. I'd like to see some action on Bannon. I must say that's taking a little time.
That was my second part of that, is that I have to make an exception with Bannon and Flynn, because I think what they're doing is dangerous. And they are still trying to incite a lot of things that need to be stopped.
Yeah, and certainly involved in our current politics every day. Erin, this is a chance to wrap up, but where can people find you on Twitter? It's at clearing_fog. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I created the clearing_fog account. It's just kind of, I try to be disciplined there and stay on message to the extent that I can, and try to provide reasonable news with some, I think, some insightful takes, but without a lot of the extra.
It's a very good feed. And of course, we should mention @Vision Surreal, who's, I can't remember his current handle, but it's @Vision Surreal is the Twitter handle. Everyone should check out his account too. It's very good. It's just very good, full of information regarding all of this. Joe, everyone can find you at Dempsey2, if I'm not mistaken, because I know I've got that wrong.
Dempsey2, TWO.
Okay. Dave, I'm going to give you the last word here. As you see us going forward, firstly, people can find you at Dave Troy, DAVETROY, and feel free to mention anything else you want to market. But where are we? Are we in a healthy spot, or are we still very much in the storm?
Well, I think from my perspective, the one thing that I feel a little bit of anxiety about is like what Erin mentioned about Flynn. I mean, those two guys are really doing some dangerous stuff right now, and they're continuing to cause ongoing harm. And so I would really like to see something, happen both of them soon in terms of just curtailing their ability to incite violence and division. That said, I do think that, what Erin said is right. What we're seeing is pretty consistent with a DOJ that is behaving responsibly and paying attention to the rule of law and all of that. I am worried about the propaganda aspects of, the fact that people feel like the rule of law is eroding and that, standards are eroding and that things really aren't being followed up on properly. And I think that can have a very demoralizing effect that if these actors are allowed to continue, could be exploited to great effect. And so I think that in that manner, we're in a very precarious position right now, but I hope the boat is listing a bit right now, but hopefully we'll see that corrected over the next, few weeks, and people will start to feel a bit more confidence in terms of how this is going to play out. But I also am really kind of glad to see that there is a little bit of awareness starting to develop around the history of this and the fact that this isn't an isolated incident. It's not really about Trump per se. It's about libertarianism and about the Kochs and the Mercers and their history with libertarianism and the overall takeover of the Republican Party by the extreme right-wing libertarian movement that really got off the ground after World War II. So I think that's all good context. And if people want to read more about, the stuff that I'm looking into, I'm really trying to look at that larger long-term history. So I do a weekly newsletter that folks can read at davetroy.medium.com, and you can sign up for a weekly email on that.
Which is also excellent. And I think your point is really valid. We have been talking in the Twitter, sphere for years now, almost it seems, about what this is really all about and the history and the context. And I remember having this conversation over a year ago about how dangerous an insurrection would look like and what an insurrection movement would look like under Trump and what would happen if the November elections weren't taken seriously. And almost all those things have happened without fail, because that is the way these movements take shape. We've seen this in other parts of the world. We've seen how they work, and we're in the middle of it, maybe even in the early parts of it. If we don't act now, we run the risk of being in a very precarious situation. We still have our functioning democratic government. It's being eroded every day. That Bannon and Flynn, Reichlin, all these people are running around in small ways and in big ways, disturbing the way democracy is meant to work. Because every time they do that, they take away someone's vote, they take away someone's voice, they install somebody who's going to be a problem down the line. It may not seem so serious now, but next November, when we need that person to certify an election and they've installed somebody who's corrupt, we're going to really feel the impact of that. So every day that these guys are allowed to continue this operation, certainly that Bannon and company and Flynn are allowed to continue operating in ways that we see and we don't see is incredibly dangerous. So I hope everyone at home takes this to heart and continues to do the enormous work that they're doing everywhere in highlighting all of this. And I congratulate all the three of you for doing the same, because I think it is so important that people like you are out there taking note, making sure that people are aware and that everyone else is amplifying that. And that it is good to see the various investigations are now looking at this very differently, certainly far differently than they were with a much narrower vision than they were on January 6th and around that time. People are beginning to see a much broader view of what's been happening. And I think that augurs well for the outcome of this investigation and the DOJ's. So on that note, thank you very much to the three of you. Thank you for being here on Narrative tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. We'll be talking about the Ghislaine Maxwell case. That'll be really interesting. Plus a lot more. We'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a good night. And thank you to you at home for supporting Narrative. We'll see you tomorrow night. Have a good night, everybody. Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.